Are you tired of losing games because of positional mistakes? In today's video, we're going to go over various different positional principles regarding pawns and pawn structures, different pieces, and general principles that will help you make better positional decisions. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. So principle number one is going to be to control the center. In chess, controlling the center is very important because it allows you to take space. It allows your pieces to develop very nicely to the central squares without them being attacked by enemy pawns. And it also restricts your opponent's development, taking away some key squares or even having the possibility to attack them with pawns and remove them from the center. Now, a move like d5 is not good right away, but later down the road, if black were to ever strike with the move e5, we would have the option of playing d5, removing this knight from here. We would also have an option of capturing depending on the situation. So having the big center allows you to maximize the value of your pieces while also minimizing the value of your opponent's pieces. And that is ultimately the goal of positional chess. Principle number two is going to be to develop all of your pieces as fast as possible, and I'm going to use Paul Morphy's opera game to demonstrate this principle. So in this position, the queen and the bishop are attacking the pawn on f7, and also the queen is attacking the pawn on b7. Black chooses to defend the pawn on f7 with queen e7, and here, instead of capturing this pawn, what Paul Morphy does is that he prioritizes development. He plays knight to c3, getting the pieces out as quickly as possible instead of capturing this pawn right here. So in this position, after c6, now the pawn is defended. Morphy continues with bishop to g5, and here b5 is played. But Morphy does not go back. He does not want to waste any time. So what he does is that he sacrifices this knight on b5. And after pawn takes b5, bishop takes b5, the knight has to block. He queenside castles, bringing this rook into play. And after rook to d8, he has one piece left. This rook on h1. This is the only piece that is not playing currently. So what Paul Morphy does in order to develop this piece is that he sacrifices the rook on d7 and then brings the final piece into play. Now every single piece is playing while black is playing without this bishop on f8 and this rook on h8. So in this position, after rook to d1, queen to e6 was played, but this quickly led to a very cool queen sacrifice, queen to b8 check, knight takes b8, and rook to d8 leads to checkmate. All of this happened because Morphy developed his pieces as quickly as possible. Principle number three is to take is a mistake. Never make any unnecessary captures. So in this position, you might think that a move like d takes c5 is a good move because it opens up the diagonal for the bishop. Now if the knight moves away, the bishop is open. However, this move allows black to get very, very active very quickly. Here's the reason why. Black will not recapture right away. He doesn't have to. He can play this move b5. Very strong move. This pawn is not going anywhere. It is still going to be taken on the next move. Let's say bishop to d3 is played, and now knight takes c5 is a tempo on the bishop, and if the bishop goes back, now there's b4. So black is just advancing forward while white is being pushed back. If instead of bishop to c2 you go rook d1, well, now you're losing the bishop pair. You can go for something like this. It is an option. However, now black has the two bishops, and this is slightly better for the black pieces. Let me show you another example. So in this position right here, if our opponents, it's white to move, if we were to capture this rook on a8, black would capture back, and now black is controlling the whole open file while we cannot challenge the black pieces on the a file right away. So this capture, this one singular capture, made our position worse. So remember, to take is a mistake and never make any unnecessary exchanges. Principle number 4 is going to be to trade off your bad pieces for your opponent's good pieces. So in this position, black has a very powerful knight on e4. However, we don't want to capture this knight with the bishop because our bishop is also a very nice piece. It is controlling this diagonal. Once the knight moves away, the bishop is going to be very powerful. But of course, we have to force the knight to move away. So instead of making this exchange, we can attack this knight and threaten to exchange it with this knight on b1 that is not doing anything at all. And in this position, both knight to c3 and knight to d2 are good moves. These are both very reasonable options. Let's just say knight c3 as an example. If our opponent takes us, that is fantastic because now we reinforce the center and we have a very powerful bishop here. We can drop this bishop back and line up an attack just like this, and we can create a kingside attack. If our opponent does not capture, well, what does he do? Because his knight is being threatened, and the only move that I can see is probably f5, and after an en passant, the knight would have to go back. Now the pawn on e6 is weak. You can attack it with rook e1, knight to g5, and this position is simply going to be better for the white pieces, and that is because we threaten to exchange our bad piece for the opponent's good piece. However, if this exchange happens, then this is fantastic because we get rid of our opponent's very powerful piece. So principle number 5 is going to be to secure weak squares. So in this position, the dark square bishops have been traded off, so we have to realize that the dark squares in our opponent's position are very, very weak. So in a position like this, what we can do is play a move like e5. So what does e5 do? First and foremost, it attacks the knight on f6. It opens up our bishop. However, it gives up this pawn on d5. Now, this is a trade-off that you have to accept. You lost this square on d5. However, you gained this square on d6. After knight to e4, this knight can jump to d6, or it can remain on e4 for a while, just controlling the pawn breaks of our opponent. That's going to be the principle of our next section. But in this case, what we are able to do is to secure this square on d6. And we're not worried about moves like knight to f4 and then exchanging on d3, because now this is a bad bishop and we're going to get a very nice outposted knight on d6. This is a very powerful piece. Most likely the rook will end up sacrificing for the knight. If not, this knight will remain here for the rest of the game. Principle number 6 is going to be to control key pawn breaks. So this position that you see on the screen right now came from the Jobava-London system. So in d4, d5 positions, we know that the main pawn breaks are either c4 or e4 for white and c5 or e5 for black. In this position, white played knight to c3. That means that he took away the option of playing c4, and therefore he has to play the e4 pawn break down the road. That is because if he doesn't play the e4 pawn break, the rooks are never going to open up, because the rooks need open files. You have to open up one of the files in order to activate the rooks. If you don't get this pawn break, then you're not going to be able to achieve that. However, in this position, what we can do as the black pieces is to go bishop to b7, control this square on e4. We're not allowing our opponent to play e4, and if our opponent plays a move like a3, let's say stopping b4, we can go c4, removing this bishop. And now this bishop no longer controls e4 either. It was forced off of the d3 square. We have full control over the c4 pawn break, which is never going to happen, and e4 pawn break, which we are restricting with the knight, with the pawn, with the bishop, and white's position is simply going to be very, very passive. From here, what black would do is simply develop with knight to d7, bishop e7, castle, and black would enjoy a better game. Principle number 7 is going to be careful when you move pawns. Every time you move a pawn, you leave weaknesses behind. In this position, the h6 pawn is under attack by white, and let's say black defends it by playing this move g5. Well, the problem with g5 is that it no longer guards these h5 and f5 squares. So after the queen moves away to f2, let's say we play b6, protecting our knight. white has this option of playing knight to g3 and knight to f5, securing a very powerful outposted square for the white knight, and black is going to be worse for the rest of the game. And what is bad for the black pieces here is that black no longer has the light square bishop, because the bishops are gone, light square bishops specifically are gone, so there are no pieces that can control this square on f5, because the bishop can't control that. The knight is misplaced, so if you were to try to remaneuver this, it would take a long time. Of course, you're not going to sacrifice the queen for the knight, so this knight on f5 is going to remain here for a very long time, exerting tremendous pressure. So be careful when you move pawns in chess. Principle number 8 is going to be to use pawns to take space. So in this position, black plays this move c5, trying to fight back against white's big center. And here we can play this move d5, and we can take away this c6 square from the knight and this e6 square from the bishop, restricting black's pieces successfully. And of course, the game still continues. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're winning. However, having more space allows us to dominate our opponent's pieces more effectively. Principle number 9 is going to be doubled pawns are not always bad. So in this position, let's say black takes our queen on b3 and we recapture with the pawn. This gives us the doubled b pawns, and some people think that doubled pawns are always bad, but that's actually not the case. Doubled pawns in this case are very, very effective. Number 1, the rook opens up. Number 2, we control more squares towards the center, especially the c4 square. It's quite useful to control it. And number 3, in the future, once this pawn is gone from here, let's say c takes d4, e takes d4, now we have an option of using our doubled pawn to go with b4 and b5 and kick this knight from this very active c6 square. Let's say e6 is played, we can immediately go b4, and even a move like a6 does not stop b5 because the a pawn is currently pinned and there is a tremendous amount of pressure on the black position. Principle number 10 is going to be isolated pawns are easy to attack. So in this position, the white rook is attacking this pawn on e7. However, it's defended by the black king. But what we can do is instead attack this pawn on c6. Let's say the rook goes to c8. We can even further activate our rook by putting it on c5. And then we can always swing it to either a5, or we can always swing it somewhere over here if we need to. Of course, we don't want to blunder the rook. And when our opponents have split pawns like this that are isolated, they're going to be very easy targets. In this position, there is one move that might hold the game for the black pieces, that is king to e6. Every other move is losing. Just goes to show how weak these pawns are and how easily they can be attacked by the white pieces. Principle number 11 is going to be double isolated pawns are the worst form of doubled pawns, and they leave major weaknesses on the board. Usually when the pawns are double isolated, the squares in front of them are very, very weak. In this case, the weak squares are f5 and f4. Since black has a light square bishop, we should sort of disregard f5 for now because we cannot get the knight there because the bishop's controlling it. However, we can get our knight to f4, which is a dark square in front of the double isolated pawns, and there's not much that black can do. If black plays a6, let's say, we go knight to f4, and this knight from f4 exerts pressure on the entire board forever because it is going to be impossible to get rid of this knight from here. Principle number 12 is going to be to fix opponent's pawns. So in this position, white has a 4-on-3 on the king side, black has a 2-on-1 on the queen side. However, due to black's structure, we can play this very, very nice move, pawn to b5, fixing these pawns over here. Now, this pawn on b6 of course cannot move because it's physically blocked. However, this pawn on a7 also cannot move because if it ever goes to a5, we can capture with en passant, and our pawn will always be faster to promotion than this pawn on b6. So this one pawn is able to dominate two pawns, and now we are freely able to bring the king as the white pieces, we are freely able to push f4, and we are freely able to create a passed pawn on this side of the board without having to worry about the queenside counterplay. So make sure to fix opponent's pawns like this whenever you get the opportunity. One pawn can dominate two, or sometimes in rare cases even 3 pawns if you imagine that there was a pawn on c7. Principle number 13 is going to be protected passed pawns are great positionally. So in a position like this, typically when you have more space, you do not want to exchange any pieces. However, in this case, there is a knight attacking the knight on e5, and there's also a bishop on f4 attacking the knight on e5. After we capture this knight, Black cannot recapture with the rook, because then Black would simply be losing that rook. Black is forced to recapture with the pawn, and this transforms the structure into a very advantageous structure for us, because after we move the bishop away, of course we don't want to blunder it, we have a protected passed pawn on the board, and this is going to be an asset throughout the entire game. It's an asset now because it's restricting this bishop right here. It is blocking and blunting this diagonal, and it is going to be an asset in the long run as well when this position goes into a king and pawn endgame. If it does, this pawn is going to be decisive. Principle number 14 is going to be knights love being towards the center. So in this position, we do not want to be playing moves like knight to h3 or moves like knight a3, because this has nothing to do with the center of the board. Since knights are short range pieces, they are the most active towards the center. Bishops can be useful away from the center sometimes because they're long range pieces. For example, if this bishop was flanked on b2, it would be pressuring the entire diagonal. So it doesn't necessarily have to be as close to the center as this knight, for example, because this knight is a short range piece. So make sure to develop your knights towards the center. But sometimes there are cases where you develop the knight away from the center temporarily. For example, in a position like this, we can play a move like knight to h6, and there is a specific reason why we're doing this. If, let's say, bishop to d3 is played, we can exchange this bishop and we can put this knight on f5. Now, even though we went to h6 in this position back here, we went away from the center, we had a clear goal for this knight, and we knew that this knight would end up on f5. We did not just randomly develop this knight to the edge of the board. Knights on the rim are dim. In this case, knight h6, you can follow it up with knight f5 later on, and it will be doing a great job on f5. Let me just make those moves once again. It is going to be doing a great job on f5, pressuring the pawn on d4, so make sure to develop the knights towards the center. Principle number 15 is going to be the fact that knights love outposts. So in a position like this, one of the best moves is to play this move pawn to c5. Now, pawn to c5 might look like a blunder to a lot of people, because after the queen moves away, we have just weakened this square on d5. However, in this position, we can play this move in knight to e5, and even if our opponent goes here, let's say with knight to d5, we can go a3, stopping all the forward knight jumps with this move pawn to a3. Let's say f6 is played, and now in a position like this, we can justify our c5 move, and we can play this move knight to c4, remaneuvering the knight to d6. Let's say a5. We don't have to play knight d6 right away, but we can jump this knight on this square, and this is a very powerful outpost. Now, a difference between the d6 outpost and the d5 outpost is that the d5 outpost is on a light square, and we both have light square bishops, so at any point we can trade our bishop for the knight. We don't have to do it right away, but we can do that. We have the option to do so, and this bishop will never be able to challenge this knight. So this principle is going to be about outposts. Knights love being on outposts. Principle number 16 is going to be understand your good and bad bishops, and I'm going to explain what those are. So in a position like this, black has most of his pawns on light squares. That means that the light square bishop is sort of stuck on c8 for now, and the dark square is the theoretically good bishop for the black pieces, while the light square bishop is theoretically bad. For white, it is the other way around, because after e3 is played, white's pawns are going to be on dark squares. I know this pawn hasn't moved, but it will move in a couple of moves, and the light square bishop is going to be the good bishop, and the dark square bishop is going to be the theoretically bad bishop. That is because the light square bishop will be on the opposite color complex as white's pawns. In spite of the fact that this bishop is considered the theoretically bad bishop, it is not bad in practice if it is able to get outside of the pawn chain. For example, after bishop to g5, let's just say bishop e7 is played, e3, the bishop is outside of the pawn chain. So from a practical point of view, this is not a bad bishop. It's just, in theory, this is what we call a good bishop, this is what we call a bad bishop. In practice, this might not be the case. For example, this bishop in this example is a bad bishop because it's stuck behind the pawns. However, if we were to change the position a little bit, let's say bishop to f5 is played and we get the same pyramid structure here. Now this bishop is outside of the pawn chain, and despite still being the theoretically bad bishop, in practice, it is not so bad. So remember, so the bishop that is on the opposite of your pawns is a good bishop, and the bishop that is on the same color complex as your pawns is the theoretically bad bishop. So how do we utilize the previous principle in our games? So in a position like this, let's say we play this move bishop to g4, and after h3, we exchange the bishop for a knight. After queen takes f3, we play this move pawn to e6. Now remember, if you trade off a bishop, in this case we traded off the light square bishop, you want to replace all of your pawns or most of your pawns on the same color as the bishop that you just traded off. So in this case, black only has the dark square bishop remaining. That means that the pawns have to control all of the light squares while the bishop controls all of the dark squares. If that's not the case, you will be left with light square weaknesses. So make sure to replace all of your pawns on light squares after you trade off the light square bishop, and replace the pawns on the same color complex as the bishop that you just traded off. Bishops also love when opponents' pawns are fixed on the same color as their color complex. So in this position, let's say we play this move knight to e4, threatening to go knight to c5 and put more pressure over here. Black exchanges. Now we are left in this endgame where these two pawns are fixed on the light squares and we both have light square bishops. And the thing here is that our opponent can never attack our pawns. Let's say e5 is played in order to attempt to develop this bishop later on. Even if this bishop somehow is able to go over here, it cannot attack the pawns on a3 and b4, but we can safely attack the pawns on a6 and b5. Of course, our opponent cannot do that because then he would lose all of his material. However, the fact that these pawns are stuck on this color complex, they are fixed on the light squares, that restricts black's options quite well. Principle number 19 is going to be opposite color bishops favor the attacking player. So in this position, the correct move, or one of the correct moves, is this move rook to d3. And what rook d3 aims to do is to maneuver this rook around to g3 and attack this black king. And it is actually very, very difficult to defend this position. The best move for black is to go f6 right away. However, if black makes a mistake, let's say rook 8 to d8 is played, we go rook g3 attacking this. Now f6 is forced, but we can take the pawn on h6. And what I want you guys to notice is that this bishop on e6 is simply unable to defend this attack because it's on dark squares. Everything's happening on the dark squares. So this light square bishop is very ineffective when it comes to defending the squares over here. So remember, when you have opposite color bishops, attack your opponents. Principle number 20 is try to get good knight versus a bad bishop situation. So in a position like this, we can play this move knight to d5. The queen has to move away. Let's just say queen goes to g5. So this knight is on a light square outpost, while this is a dark square bishop that is blocked in by its own pawns. Therefore, this is a good knight. Let me just remove the arrows. Good knight versus a bad bishop situation, and this is advantageous for the side that has the good knight. So make sure to trade all of the minor pieces except this bishop right here that is blocked in by its own pawns, and then you will be able to access this square with your knight. You can also try to get a good bishop versus a bad knight situation if the pawns are fixed on the same color. Opponent's pawns are fixed on the same color as your bishop. In this case, pawns are fixed on light squares. White has a light square bishop, and they are on both sides of the board. So both sides of the board have pawns. If both of these criterias are met, that means that the bishop will dominate the knight. Principle number 22 is going to be rooks love open files, so make sure you put them on open files. So in this position, it is white to move. You would not want to play a move like rook to e1 or rook to b1, or maybe even this rook to b1, because they would be behind pawns. Why would you want to put your rooks behind these pawns? Instead, you want to put them on open files. Now, to extend the previous principle, this principle is going to be about how if there are less open files in the position, dominating them with rooks becomes more important. So in this position, there's only one open file, and that is the A file. If black were to capture this rook on A1, we would capture back, and we would have some advantage here with the white pieces. Black is unable to oppose us on the only open file. If there are multiple open files in the position, controlling them with the rooks is not really as advantageous as if there was only one open file, such as in this position right here. Controlling this file is more important because this is the only open file in the position. Principle number 24 is going to be put the rooks on the 7th rank. So in this position, the correct move is rook to c7, rook 1 to c7 to be precise. And in this position, because both rooks are on the 7th rank, it is very, very difficult to defend the position. Rook to f8 is of course the only move, and now you would play a move like rook to a7, for example, attacking this and this, and it is very difficult to find a move for the black pieces. Black basically cannot move anything. If g6 is played, you have this tactic with rook takes f7, and how do you avoid this tactic? The only way is to capture on a7, and then of course you would lose the pawn on a6 later down the road. But the point is, rooks on the 7th rank are devastating, so if you ever get the opportunity, put them on the 7th rank, and this will destroy your opponent's position. And principle number 25 is going to be queen loves discoordinated pieces. In this position, both rooks are attacking this pawn on b2. Let's defend it with b4. And now there really is not a good move in this position for the black pieces because this pawn is hanging, this pawn is under tremendous amount of pressure. And what do? Rook c8 is covered, rook e8 is covered. There are not a lot of moves for the black pieces. If this black rook could teleport to c2, black might even be winning because you would be attacking f2 and the queen has to come back somewhere. Actually, from d7 it cannot go back anywhere to defend this pawn, so this would actually just be winning for the black pieces if this rook was on c2 coordinated with the rook on d2. However, that's not exactly possible here because this rook is on b8 and queen loves that. When you have an imbalance of queen versus 2 rooks or queen versus 3 minor pieces, queen loves the chaos. Minor pieces or the rooks love stability. They want to be coordinated. They want to be protected. If they are separated like this, it's going to be very difficult to play with them. For example, if you go rook to a2, now there's queen c7 attacking this rook. What do? The rook has to move. Let's say it goes over here. Now you take a7. You have two connected passed pawns. You could not take on a7 right away, by the way, because there was rook takes b4. That is why you played this move, kick the rook out of here, and then take this pawn. And because these two rooks are not coordinated, it creates a lot of problems for the black pieces.